3 weeks ago, my family and I rose out of the underground to face the famous turrets of the Tower of London. We walked past St. Thomas's Keep, the stronghold built by King Edward I in the 1270s, 20 years before he expelled the Jews of Britain. We then walked along the River Thames toward Buckingham Palace, Parliament and Big Ben, along a majestic and floral garden lined with the statues memorializing figures from English history. And at the end of that line, we came face to face with the bronze effigy of a man who was burned at the stake for defying Henry VIII and translating the Bible into English, the 15th century theologian William Tyndale. And in the moments before the flames were lit, his last words left his lips, which were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And seeing that statue at that time put me in mind of other British figures whose legacies have been defined by the words that they said with their final breaths as they faced their execution. William Wallace, the Scottish knight, who spent his life fighting against the same King Edward who expelled the Jews, is imagined to have said a single word before his execution: freedom. Guy Fawkes, an activist for Catholic toleration who participated in the plot to bomb the then Protestant and intolerant Houses of Parliament, is thought to have said right before his death, "A desperate disease requires a dangerous remedy." But it was the son of the king that Guy Fawkes conspired to kill, who was himself the only monarch in British history to be indicted, tried, and condemned to death on charges of high treason. And as he was led to be beheaded for a crowd outside the banqueting house of Whitehall Palace, an act that would initiate England's only ever republic, he looked to the public and said 9 striking words. "A subject and a sovereign," he said, "are clean, different things." And unlike Fawkes or Wallace or Tyndale, those final words failed to inspire a sense of empathy within me. In fact, if I was standing in that crowd on the fence about the king's fate and then heard him saying that as king, he was fundamentally better than me, essentially superior to me, innately nobler than me, I think that I might be swayed in favor of his execution. Which leads us to ask what on earth he was thinking and why even for a moment he imagined that his last words might inspire his audience to take his side. But the truth is, many did take his side, and just over a decade later, when Cromwell's republic fell, the English public welcomed his son, Charles II, back to the throne with open arms. And the question, one that plagued the revolutionaries of that day, is why? Why did a people freed from a tyrant seek the return of a king? And the truth is, that very same question can be asked of our ancestors based on the text that we read this morning. Moshe describes a moment in time that seems for him an inevitability. Ki tavo la'aretz, when you come into the land, he says, Asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, that God will give you, va'amarta, and you will say, Asima alai melech, I seek to set a king over me. Kachol hagoyim asher svivotai, like all the nations around me. When you say that, says Moses, Som tasim alecha melech, you shall appoint over yourself a king. And while it is true that for a range of Jewish thinkers this represents the endorsement of an ideal political vision with a mandate to establish a biblical monarchy, for a number of others this sentence represents a profound concession on the part of God, whose tone in this moment billows with loathing. In the words of the 14th century Spanish mystic and commentator Rabbeinu Bachya, Ra'ui haya she'yachashev zeh lahem l'cheit, this future request should best be seen as a sin. For him, we were freed from Egypt, bequeathed our liberty, and released from the shackles of imperial tyranny to dwell in peace beneath the canopy of heaven. In his words, Misha Adon ha'olam hu balko, for those who have the creator of the cosmos as their king. Machet so b'melech basar v'dam. What need have they for an emperor of flesh and blood? Why after centuries of Egyptian brutality, after seeing the ability of absolute power to enable cruelty and atrocities with impunity, would a free people under the guidance of God seek the return of a king? In fact, so seriously misconceived and profoundly self-defeating would this apparently inevitable request be for our sages, that they imagine God's response as follows: I had intended for you to be free of monarchy. But that is not what you wanted. You've asked for a king. So by your lives, in the end, you will see what will become of you, mitachat malkachem, under your kings. And the history of biblical kingship is indeed a sordid tale. From Saul to Sidkiyahu, other than a handful of exceptional figures who lived lives of piety and led by example, the kings of Israel brought ruin to our people. They built shrines to idols, prioritized alliances with pagan wives over the lives of their subjects, and dragged the nation into a whole host of ill-advised wars, which in the end led to our exile. From the dawn of our history, we have been taught to detest any system that would invest absolute power in a human being, because we are all fallible and can all fall prey to the temptations of power. In the words of Rabbeinu Bachya once more, HaTorah asra lanu habitachon b'basar v'adam. The Torah forbids us from putting faith in flesh and blood. So for Rabbeinu Bachya and these sages, we come back to a question that has lingered through the ages. Why would a people freed from the evils of tyranny wish for the return of a king? And to answer that question, we need to go back to the beginning. Imagine waking up on a morning like today, but suffering from a very unusual species of amnesia. Imagine that you remember the name of every object that you see, tables, chairs, windows, plates, and people, but you cannot identify value or worth. You cannot remember how to apportion importance. And as you look at the world's diversity, as if for the first time, you see gems and bees, stars and trees, clouds and puddles and people. And you find yourself feeling a deep unease at the panoramic and haphazard multiplicity. Because as it turns out, the human mind is primed to prefer design over disorder, to despise the unsystematic and organize the untidy. We as human beings have a propensity to seek neat structures and to engage in what the celebrated psychologist and historian Michael Shermer calls patternicity. In his book, subtitled From Ghosts and Gods to Politics and Conspiracies, he writes quite simply that the brain is a belief engine. From the data flowing in through the senses, the brain naturally begins to look for and find patterns, and then infuses those patterns with meaning. And it is this patternicity that led many centuries ago the poets and philosophers of ancient Greece and those elsewhere in the ancient Near East to see an innate hierarchy in nature, a ladder of matter which came to be called the great chain of being. Stones were ranked from diamonds down to dirt. Trees were ranked from oak down to weeds, animals from eagles to beetles, and of course the hierarchy does not stop there. Human beings were ranked from kings and queens to commoners. And this great chain of being came to be seen by the Greeks and those who absorbed their thought as the divine design of the cosmos, which is exactly where the idea of the divine right of kings comes from. To seek to unseat a king was seen as a protest against the divine design, an attack on the human being who was literally born to rule, govern, and reign. And this is why, when Charles I stood before a crowd in the moments before his execution, he said, with the sincere expectation of convincing them, a subject and a sovereign are clean, different things. And that is why many of the pious men and women in that crowd took his side. And that is why, when he was beheaded, we're told, there were no cheers, but an eerie, uneasy, even guilty silence. There was a sense that the cosmic balance had been upset, that God's providence would avenge the rebellion against the Great Chain, which is why they embraced Charles II 10 years later, and why today Charles III wears the crown. We are drawn by our brains to see an innate structure in nature. We have a predisposition to see the strong as more important and born to rule, and to see the weak as less worthy and born to serve. Our eyes apprise our minds of the cosmic order and advise us to align with the great chain of being at the evident behest of heaven. And that is why, for a number of scholars, however surprising it may seem, so many in history who have been freed from tyranny seek the return of a king. In fact, it was the anti-fascist German novelist Thomas Mann who, in a 1924 story, wrote, "It is a cruel misunderstanding of youth to believe that it will find its heart's desire in freedom. Its deepest desire is to obey." And Bret Stephens, the prodigy editor of the Jerusalem Post and columnist for the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, put it as follows: "Every society consists of people who actively want tyranny, either to exercise it themselves or to submit to it. Nobody," he says, "is born with the habits of a free mind. They are difficult to learn and tempting to dismiss," which is why, for Rabbeinu Bachya, God reluctantly permits kingship. And this morning we saw how heaven limits any king's power and resources in all sorts of ways, how he is forced to read a copy of the law each and every day, how he is made to see himself as entirely responsive to and responsible for the state and the fate of the nation. It is hard to overstate just how radical a departure these rules were from the pervasive norms of the day, where the king, in Michael Walzer's words, for us, had no cosmological significance. From the very beginning, there is a biblical insistence that every single human being bears the image of God, that every single human being is essentially equal, that no human being sits either higher or lower on a chain, that not one of us is born to rule, because we are all born to serve God and each other. So as we enter this Elul, let us all find ways to build up the habits of a free mind, the habits which remind each of us of our ability to shape our souls, escape our fate, and pave our own destiny. As Maimonides puts it in his Laws of Repentance, Kol Adam Ra'ui Lo, Liot Tzadik Kamoshe, or Rasha Kayaravam. Every person is capable of being as righteous as our supreme prophet, or as wicked as our worst king. O Chacham, O Sachal, O Rahman, O Achsari, O Kili, O Shu'ah. We can all choose to be more wise or more reckless, to be more compassionate, or more cruel, to be more giving, or more mean-spirited. For us, there is no great chain of being, but there is a great chain of tradition, which teaches us to reach for our better angels and heal the world. Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov.